thank you for coming to the closing remarks. It sounds like we have all had an amazing last couple days. I actually wore my boots for Austin, which I have to say is pretty good for a Canadian gal, which is where I'm from. Woo, Nova Scotia. All right. So I want to just say a few things about the last couple days. We've heard about visionary work. We've heard about inspiring projects, and we've heard a lot about different things where we really need to push ourselves around accountability. And we started off with a visionary, Chris Luecki, about harvesting water and who knew rocket fuel from asteroids. And we've been inspired by Architecture for Humanity. Despite the national nonprofit shutting its doors late last year, the chapters are still going and having impactful work. And then just recently, actually just before my session, I sat in on the green chemistry panel. And they called for greater accountability and transparency with furniture material. So I want to thank all of you for sharing your stories, your work, and your wisdom. You're making us a better community. So for the next 25 minutes more or so, I want to talk about product development. And I want to push this last theme of accountability that we've been hearing a little bit about the last couple days. When we talk about sustainability, we are really talking about accountability to our users, to the environment, to society. And design, as many of you know, is powerful. We can leverage it to solve big problems, to improve people's lives and the health of our world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my background really quickly. Joe mentioned that I worked in Kenya. For those of you who've worked in East Africa, you'll know this picture is actually not from East Africa, it's from Mali. But the technology there is called a treadle pump, and I worked as a manufacturing engineer there for a little while. And the treadle pump is fairly revolutionary in the sense that it enabled smallholder farmers to increase their acreage, so about a hectare. But what you saw often is that they were irrigating a smaller plot with rainwater and getting bucket water from local streams. And this product enabled them to expand their acreage, have better quality crops, and have more growing seasons. And so I was this kind of peon manufacturing engineer. But I mention this, and I'm going to mention my work in Iraq too, because this was a formative experience for me in terms of realizing that design of the product doesn't necessarily solve the problem. You have to understand how the product fits in the context of the problem. And the challenge, of course, was manufacturing. In Kenya, and you see here a fundi welding the pump together. A fundi is an artisan in Swahili. But the challenge really was making consistent product, high quality products, so that the farmers could continue to irrigate their crops over time. And this picture, I love this picture because this is everything boring about manufacturing. This was the inspection of the pumps before they went out. But really the lesson I took home was focus on solving the problem, not just the product. This is a picture that was taken in Baghdad. It's at Baghdad South Power Plant, and this is from 2005. And so Joe mentioned I worked for the US State Department. I was the worker bee doing electricity reconstruction. And this was an interesting project in the sense that everything went wrong. Those of you who followed reconstruction in general, everything kind of went wrong. And with electricity in particular, what had happened was the US government invested in power generations and power plants because what their goal was to get as much electricity to Iraqis as possible. But of course, a power plant is just part of a system. It needs fuel to go into it, and it also needs to be transmitted and distributed to homes. And that wasn't part of the equation. And so this was formative for me in the sense of, first of all, just being there, but also understanding that if you're going to design a product, it has to fit into the system. And that's, of course, so important for everything we talk about in terms of sustainability. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about D-Rev. D-Rev is short for Design Revolution. This is our mission. It's to design and deliver medical devices that close the quality healthcare gap for underserved populations. And when I say underserved populations, really our focus has been people who live on less than $4 a day, so the low-income parts of the world. And we actually act more like a medical device startup, but we're structured as a nonprofit. But I say we act like a for-profit in the sense that instead of trying to maximize financial return, we're trying to maximize impact. And we say impact is our currency. So I was going to jump off the stage and try and talk about the design process, but I realized I'm going to have a hard time getting back on. But I'm going to talk through, this is how, this kind of process of how we think of design. So you start with identify, which is understanding the problem, understanding your users, understanding the context, understanding the price points, the market, everything you really need to do do product requirements and be designing a product. And then the design phase is what we usually think about when we talk about design. It's the brainstorming and the prototyping and testing and iterating and building the product, however you define the product. In our case, it's a medical device. And then delivery is, okay, this commercial ready product now is getting to users, and what does that look like? So it is manufacturing, distribution, marketing. With medical devices, it's also regulatory. It can be intellectual property. All of those things you really need to get to users. And then we've tended to focus on a launch market, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But so we launch in one country, typically India, and then we scale to the other countries where there's a need. And we've tended to focus on problems that are global in nature. And then because we're a nonprofit, we care passionately about measuring. Not just measuring how many products have gone out the door, but how many lives we're impacting. And how are we really solving the problem that we set out to do. So I know the designers in the room are probably thinking that's a very nice, neat, chronological design process. This is actually what it really looks like. And I would say this is what it should look like if you're doing it properly, because you want to be thinking about designing for scale in the very beginning. You want to be thinking about, if you want to measure the impact of your product, can you design it into the product? So 3 principles to know about how we approach design. The first is that we design world-class products, and that means that they perform on par or better than the best products on the market. And this is a little bit different than a typical product design. Even from my treadle pump days, there was this idea that if you're designing for lower income populations, good enough is good enough. And what we're saying is no. Regardless of your income level, regardless of where you live, you want the best possible product for your family. The second thing is we're user-centric. Of course, when we talk about design, everybody's user-centric. And I would say, I like to say we're user-obsessed. And in this sense, it's understanding who all of your users are, not just your end users. And with medical devices, you may have the patient, but you have the doctor, you have the nurse who may be using the device. You have someone who's making a purchasing decision, which in public hospitals, in places like India, may or may not even go in some of the hospitals. And sometimes you have people who are doing repairs. And understanding all of their needs. And by understanding their needs, you also know where you can make trade-offs. And then the third thing about us is that we're market-driven. And what that means is that our products are sold through the market. And so that results in a few things that need to happen. One is that we design for extreme affordability, building in profit margins so that once the product hits the market, it's totally economically self-sustaining on its own. And I feel very strongly about selling our products. And the reason is that it holds us accountable to our users. If they don't buy our products, we've not succeeded. So I'm going to tell you about our 2 products, starting with Brilliance. Brilliance is the phototherapy device, and that's the blue light you see there over the bassinet. This photo was taken in a neonatal intensive care unit at a large maternity hospital in Nepal, in Kathmandu, Nepal. Brilliance started actually when a doctor approached one of our colleagues and said, in global health and like newborn global health, the community is really focused on the big ticket items. Sepsis, which is infection, asphyxia, the baby breathing, and preterm care. But she said, we have babies who are having brain damage from just jaundice in our hospitals. And no one's really looking at that in a meaningful way. And so we looked into it a little bit more, or a lot more, and found that actually 18% of all babies in low-income parts of the world need to be treated for jaundice. It's actually about half of all babies, or a little bit more, have some degree of jaundice, but these are the babies who need to be treated with the blue light. And this number is higher in low-income parts of the world, and the reason is because there are more babies who are born premature. Here in the US, it's about 12% of babies who need to be treated. And we don't really think about it here because, when you have a baby, and I've had 2 now, they have the heel prick, and then the doctor looks at the bilirubin levels, which is what causes it, and makes a decision. We don't really think about it. But jaundice is the #1 reason why newborns are readmitted to hospitals, and this is throughout the world. And the way phototherapy works, that blue light, is that the blue light shines through the baby's skin and breaks down bilirubin, which is a neurotoxin, which otherwise would accumulate in the brain, but it breaks it down and the babies pee it out. But the thing to know is that if it does accumulate in the brain, it can cause cerebral palsy, it can cause deafness, and the baby can even die. And so once the child's kind of in a danger zone and with hyperbilirubinemia, elevated bilirubin levels, you really want to get them to a hospital and treatment very quickly. So this is the yearly unmet need for phototherapy. You can see it's mostly sub-Saharan Africa and Asia, and it's a minimum of about 7 million babies. We work with Dr. Vinod Bhutani at Stanford University, and he actually thinks the number is at least double. And the reason why the medical community doesn't really fully understand the numbers is because, as you can imagine, a lot of babies are in the world are born outside of institutions. They're born outside of hospitals. And so families may not even know the baby's ill until the baby needs to be treated for jaundice until the baby has become lethargic and needs to be taken in. So one of the questions is, why is there this need for phototherapy? And the reason is that standard phototherapy devices are $3,000 or more. So again, this is just blue light, but these are very expensive blue lights. And this is what we see in hospitals. So this is a photo taken at a pediatric hospital in Karnataka, India. Karnataka is a state in India. And you see two babies, they're preterm. They're pretty healthy other than they're preterm, but they're both being treated for jaundice. And you'll notice that the baby, I have to think about what side you're on the left, who's not wearing eye covers, which is not ideal. It's also not ideal that you'd have two babies being treated together. But the baby on the left isn't receiving much treatment because this phototherapy device is tube bulbs. It's fluorescent tube bulbs. So there's 6 bulbs there, and you can kind of see that 3 of those bulbs are burned out. And this bulb issue is something that we've seen time and time again. This is a photo from another hospital in India. This is actually a pretty nice hospital. But here, the medical grade blue bulbs have been replaced with white bulbs. And the thing to know is that in this case, if you're using tube bulbs in phototherapy devices and you're in a fairly busy hospital, you need to be replacing those bulbs every 4 to 6 months. And one of the things we've seen is the challenge that hospitals are facing just even getting these bulbs. And a colleague of mine who was in Nigeria actually saw a hospital that had bulbs that had been painted blue because they were having such a hard time procuring them. So this is Brilliance, what I told you a little bit about. So yes, it is a really highly intense blue lamp, but there's some really cool stuff designed in. One is that the medical community is just now being able to understand like what quality of blue light, what kind of band on the spectrum best breaks down the bilirubin level. And so we've been able to take advantage of that and integrate it into Brilliance. The other thing is we use LEDs. And as many of you know, LEDs, much more efficient. They give off less heat. And while we weren't the first to use LEDs with phototherapy, I do think that we were probably one of the early ones to do optical modeling. And with optical modeling, we can use less bulbs and we can use less lenses and still have a very even footprint for the baby to be in the light. The next thing is thermal management. So a typical phototherapy device has a fan, and if you have a fan, you need to have another fan for redundancy. And these are more expensive, and there are more things to break. So we do passive cooling with Brilliance, so we can get rid of those components. And then lastly, Brilliance units are what I call self-assessing, which might be a little bit of an overstatement, but each Brilliance unit tracks how much it's being used. And the reason why we do that is because we want to know how many babies each of these devices have treated. So based on the usage time, we can estimate the number of babies, and then based on the hospital's profile, we can estimate the counterfactual, which is how many babies are now effectively treated who wouldn't have otherwise received effective treatment without Brilliance. And then from that number, we can estimate the deaths and disabilities averted. We're very nerdy about this stuff, but if you want more details, come talk to me after. The key thing, though, is that this device is $500, and it's actually $500 internationally plus shipping and tariffs. If you buy it in India, it's closer to $400. But the great thing, too, is that there's no replacement bulbs, right? With LEDs, LEDs just really last and last. And one of the things that's been very interesting, as we've talked to doctors are like, well, how do you replace them? And the sales folks at our partner have said, well, you don't replace them. And they're like, no, you have to replace them, which has been an interesting challenge for us just in terms of psychology of users and buyers. So I mentioned a partner. We did not get this product to market all by ourselves. We licensed it to the biggest maker of neonatal equipment in India named Phoenix Medical Systems, and they're based in Chennai. And here you can see the first batch of Brilliance units in November 2012 when they launched. And well, even though our colleagues there aren't smiling, I can tell you we were all so proud when these finally got to market. Our relationship with Phoenix is fairly unique. They're a for-profit, privately held company. We're a nonprofit. And what we did is that we said, first of all, we're going to cap the price based on the bill of materials because we did not design this very affordable product, to last mile have a huge margin built in and have the product sold, for example, at $2,900 or $2,800. So that's how we got to our price point. And then the other thing we told Phoenix is, hey, if you sell to a low-income hospital, and we have like a short list of criteria, you can essentially keep all the royalties. But if you sell to a higher-income hospital or a hospital in a high-income country, then we're going to take full royalties. And so what we were trying to do was to financially incentivize our partner, who's a for-profit. But what we found is, yes, that worked, but both organizations really similarly were aligned in terms of motivation, in terms of trying to reach children who otherwise wouldn't have effective care. So where are we now? I mentioned that India has been our launch market, and it's worth saying why. 20% of all live births are in India, so for the world. And in fact, if you dig even down a little bit more, there's 3 states in India, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh, that represent 10% of the world's babies. And so India alone, if you can have an impact on newborn health there, you're really having an impact on the world. Since launch, though, that we estimate that about 83,000 at-risk babies have been treated by our device by Brilliance, and this is actually in 35 countries. So we've done better than we expected, which is pretty exciting. But our goal is to reach at least 1 million babies in the next 5 years. So if you remember the need slide, you'll remember, though, that this is nothing compared to what the need is. And my goal actually is to push industry. So we want to have direct impact through our product, but we really want to push competitors to compete with us. And in that way, we hope that we can end brain damage and death from jaundice. So I don't want to make it sound like we figured all this stuff out. So I thought I would throw in a few challenges we've had along the way. So with Brilliance, that first batch of Brilliance units, you saw the 25, of those 5 went to a Filipino distributor. And then we found out that the Filipino distributor turned around and marked them up to $2,400. So even though we had put all these safeguards in, with Phoenix and with our own work, in the last mile, those 5 units went off at a much higher price. But what we had to learn to do was to get involved with vetting distributors. We had thought that once we had passed it off to Phoenix, D-Rev, we could step back and do the things we were better at, which was not distribution, which was not sales or manufacturing. But we've gotten involved with vetting distributors in these various countries, which has been fantastic. It wasn't as expensive as we thought. And we've learned a lot about different healthcare sectors and have kind of built our network of knowledge for future product development too. I'm going to talk about the Remotion Knee now. And you see Agung here, and he lives in Bali, Indonesia, and he's a construction worker. He's actually a contractor. And he was one of our super users during testing. So this project started when the Jaipur Foot Clinic in India approached Stanford University, one of their biomechanical engineering classes, and said, we have a knee, it's a bit inferior, we would like a better knee, but it needs to be very low cost. And what they were seeing is low-income amputees, so people who were living on less than $4 a day, really just didn't have access to anything. You see 3 gentlemen here, they were literally using a bamboo staff to get around. And if you can imagine, you now don't have one hand to carry, to do things with. And the terrain is rough, so you're struggling to get over ground that's not flat. And so it's a real challenge for people in this situation. And in many cases, too, because of the social stigma, people don't leave home. And so in terms of the need, there's about 10 million above-knee amputees in low-income countries. And of those, about 9.5 million are without a prosthetic. So that means that only 500,000 have been fit with a leg system. And these are WHO numbers, and we think they're pretty high, but one of the challenges we've seen is that Many of these amputees, they can't reach the clinics, or the clinics may not even know about them. So what are your options if you need a leg system? And we've worked on the knee because it's the most complex, and it's usually the most expensive component of a leg system. So here you see a $20,000 knee. This is something that an American vet coming back from a war zone who's been injured may be fit with. And it's programmable. It's pretty badass. Like, it can do lots of different things. And here you have what's called the Red Cross knee, the ICRC knee, International Committee for the Red Cross. And it's much more affordable, but what you have in affordability now, you lose out with performance. It's a single axis knee. So single axis is just what it sounds, like a door hinge. So you have an axis and it just rotates around that axis. But as you can imagine, as you shift your weight over that axis, you lose stability. So if you're trying to walk on rough terrain, it's very difficult. And in fact, you can see some switches right above that axis point, and that's to lock the knee. And so what we've seen in the field actually is many people wear this Red Cross knee as a peg leg, as a lock knee. And so this is our knee. It's, we call it the Remotion Knee, and it's $80, and you can see it here, and I'll pass it around. A few things I want to warn you about, but also a few things to look for. It's a polycentric mechanism, and what that means for the engineers in the room, it's a 4-bar mechanism, but it rotates as it translates, and that's actually what your knee does as you walk. If you take a look at it, though, there's a spring right here, and that's to help the amputee bring the leg forward, because otherwise you'd be swinging your hip, and it can be quite exhausting. So that's what the spring is in the back. If you want to open it, it can be a little bit challenging. You just want to push right here. It doesn't open kind of as you'd expect, like a hinge. The other thing I'll point out, if I'm going to pass it around too, is that there's a little noise dampener here. This product has been through a lot of iterations, but one of the most difficult things that we tackled was the knee originally clicked. And then we moved the noise, we put a noise dampener in, and then we found that farmers in kind of muddy conditions were using it, and then it was going. So we had to keep moving the noise dampener around, and we finally, hopefully, got it right. But I'll pass it around. Thanks, Morgan. So I want to show a short video. It's I've been kind of talking at a high level about product development and the impact, but I thought it would be useful to show one of our users, and this is a young man named Dinesh.
मेरा नाम दिनेश है। जब मैं स्कूल से लौट रहा था तो मैं बस में चढ़ के जा रहा था, तो उसमें गेट बंद हो गया था, तो मुझे पैर रखने का जगह नहीं मिला था। फिर मैं नीचे गिर पड़ा था, तभी बस मेरे ऊपर से चली गई थी। यहाँ पे आकर उधर सफदरजंग में गए थे ना, तो एक डॉक्टर जी ने यहाँ की सूचना दी कि यहाँ पे जाइए। फिर हम यहाँ पे आए थे। मैं 7th क्लास में पढ़ता हूँ। मैं चेस, लूडो, क्रिकेट यही पहले जब लगाया था तब थोड़ा गिरता था, फिर अब ठीक हूँ। चलने के अलावा खेल सकता हूँ, इधर उधर जा सकता हूँ घूमने।
इसमें क्या फर्क है? मतलब जब तुम्हें पहली बार पैर लगा तो तुम्हें कैसा लगा?
मुझे लगा मैं चल सकता हूँ।
I mentioned that this project started at Stanford University. We absorbed that student team, and in fact, the engineer who leads that team is one of those original students. His name's Vinesh Narayan. And I mentioned that we had this long product development process, and that's because we kept testing and redesigning and testing and redesigning. In fact, we did about 5 iterations over 6 years. And to date now, we have over 7,000 amputees who are wearing our knee, and this is due to that original partner, the Jaipur Foot Clinic in India, because they've worked with clinics throughout the world. The interesting thing, as we've been talking about it a little bit more, the project itself, we've gotten requests from all over the world, over 30, it might even be over 40 at this point. The thing you may also notice is that some of these requests are not coming from low-income countries, they're coming from higher-income countries, just because there's a need for greater diversity on the market. So our goal is to reach I'm going to see if it comes up, about 40,000 amputees in the next few years. And again, this is very low. One of the challenges that we've really run into is the number of skilled clinicians who are able to fit the leg system. And that's one of our biggest barriers. In terms of challenges, though, I thought I would mention one with Remotion, too. You're looking at a picture of a prosthetics clinic in Nairobi, Kenya. And it has 4 skilled clinicians there who are able to fit amputees. And this is incredible. Like, rarely do you see a clinic like this that has 4 clinicians who can fit. And the day I was there, they were very busy, and there was a row of amputees waiting in the hallway, sitting. But they weren't getting fit. And finally, I asked, and I said, "Are you not fitting today?" And one of the clinicians, the woman there, said, "The feet aren't in." And that was very eye-opening for us too, because again, as a nonprofit, we're not about just getting our product out there, we're about solving the problem. And so all of a sudden we realized, like, oh gosh, there's a lot more than just getting a knee to these clinics. You have to get the knee consistently there to clinics, but they also have to have the other components. They have to have the skilled clinicians. So it made us also think about, in the design process, if you're going to take the system design approach, you do have to design in the reliability of shipping. And then one of the things we'll be doing next year is also bundling other components to address some of these other issues. So I gave you a good overview of D-Rev, and I want to kind of transition to a broader conversation with some of the things you've seen here this week. Well, one of the things about design, and I've definitely learned with D-Rev, is there's always new problems coming up, and I think that's something we see, and we've heard a lot about a lot of problems here. But I also think that's one of the things that's really exciting about the work we do, is that there are problems to solve. Of course, we want the problems to go away, but every day is different. And I also think in being in design, we're also by nature optimists. I want to talk about design, though, a little bit more generally, and the accountability to users, society, and the environment. Like many of you, and I know this has come up already this week, but the news of Volkswagen cheating with the emission standards really made me ill, and I know it probably made many of you here. And it's not just because of the pollution their diesel cars were putting out, but how they betrayed users and betrayed the public. Installing software to cheat emissions tests is really horrible, especially while publicly espousing sustainability. And so I know you've seen this, but this is a still from their 2004 advertising campaign, and it shows engineers sprouting angel wings every time 100,000 cars have been sold. And it's clear now they confuse sales with virtue. And I wasn't in the panel, but I heard Hunter Levins also knew that this was coming and had known that the diesel cars couldn't deliver what Volkswagen had been promising. To me, VW's cheating is one of the most egregious examples of failure of accountability. But at the same time, I want to be really clear that there are small ones every day that we shouldn't overlook. And I want to use you guys actually for the next one. So there's a little bit of audience participation. Who here owns an iPhone 6? And you can raise your hand. All right. Now I want you to leave your hand up. Leave it up, leave it up, leave it up. Okay, and I have one too. Leave it up if you've cracked your screen. Okay, so there's a good number of you. I've been doing an informal poll, and there's a lot of us. You can put your hand down now, thank you. But so the question to me with this is a problem of use, or is this a problem of design? Because when I went to the Apple store and I presented my broken screen, I got really mad because he's like, this is going to be $115. I've heard different people paying different things. And I said, no, this is a problem of design. And he said, ma'am, I understand, but you dropped your phone. And I said, phones get dropped. But the reason I want to bring this up is because I do think there's a tendency to blame the user. And blaming the user is another failure of accountability. I want to mention, though, there's a lot of groups out there that are inspiring us, besides many of you in the room. I wanted to mention some design ones. The Designers Accord started in 2007, and they set out to build sustainability practices in the creative communities. I know many of you take part. And then more recently, we saw a group of designers in healthcare that have put out a designer's oath, and that's like the Hippocratic Oath, to do no harm. So before you go off to the party, and have hopefully a ruckus time. One last thing I want to say is that many of us here are creating things, and creating solutions is challenging. It's a process filled with stops and starts and scratching things out, and I think whether you're a writer or you're a designer or you're creating anything, you know what I'm talking about. But going back to the optimism, I want to say that we're really lucky that we're able to create. A small idea becomes a sketch. An idea grows with consideration and with contributions from other people. It moves from a prototype to lines of code to a rough cut. It becomes a product that solves problems and addresses needs. And in its concreteness and the product's concreteness, we designers are accountable. We creators are accountable. And that requires truth and conscience. Great products elevate our world to new possibilities. They advance our knowledge and capabilities. And ultimately, Joe mentioned this earlier, what works for humankind must also work for the planet. So as you return to your work, your practice, your life, please embrace your truth and conscience of our work. And please hold yourself and others to the highest standards, because to create is our highest privilege. And thank you.
Thank you so much. We're going to do a little Q&A, so you can go to slido.com, #South by Southwest Eco, and type in some questions. And in the meantime, I was wondering if you could share with us what's next for D-Rev.
Sure. So our big thing is getting the knee to market. I mentioned it was 6 years. We ran into a lot of late-stage challenges, but getting it to market. And now we're actually building up our R&D. And I'd love to get 4 new products into our pipeline by the end of next year.
Awesome. Does D-Rev work with any 3D printed devices? And what potential do you see for patients to print their own devices in the future?
Great question. So we do work with 3D printed. Right now, where it's mostly around prototyping and rapid iteration, which has been huge for us. Joe mentioned that we're part of Autodesk portfolio, and we have access. Who's here from San Francisco? There's got to be a few of you. Okay, yeah. So Autodesk has this amazing Pier 9, which is like the production prototyping facility that's like the dream of all of us who are design and engineers. So we've used theirs quite a bit. 3D printing is really promising for sockets. I didn't mention this, but how the knee kind of fits into the leg system is you have an amputee and there's a socket that fits over the residual limb, and then there's a knee, and then there's a pylon, think like your shin, and then a foot. The socket has been really challenging, and when we see people stop wearing their leg system, it's often because the socket is really uncomfortable. And there's some really promising work that's happening right now with 3D printed sockets. It's not there yet, but hopefully in the near future.
Great, thank you. Can sunlight be used to treat jaundice in babies?
It can, but there's some challenges with it. And if you were a smaller group, I'd make you guess. But we actually helped a professor at University of Minnesota test filtered sunlight. And what her setup looked like is like a frame kind of made out of plastic tubing, and then a plastic filter that took out all of the spectrum of light except for blue. And you can probably guess, I'll just back up and say, the reason why you want to be filtering out the other spectrum is because there's UV light in there, right? And you have very delicate newborns with very delicate skin, and you don't want them out in the sun. However, that is what a lot of hospitals are doing. We've seen hospitals in Uganda, we've seen hospitals in India who, without access to good quality phototherapy, are putting their babies out in the sun. My daughter had jaundice, and the doctor said just kind of put her by the window, and that worked because she wasn't very severely jaundiced. But using sunlight and filtered sunlight is really challenging for a few other reasons. One is the baby needs to be nearly naked so that the light is shining on the skin. So the ambient temperature has to be close to the core temperature of the baby, otherwise the baby gets too hot or too cold. The other thing is you only have about 12 hours of sunlight a day, particularly in equatorial regions. And a baby who's really sick needs about 2 to 3 days of continuous treatment, except for nursing. One last thing I'll mention, though, is when we saw this testing with University of Minnesota, we saw the moms kept picking their babies up. And there's just this discomfort of having your baby out there. And so we would see the moms holding the babies just because of that from a user standpoint.
Biomimicry has been a big part of this conference, and they're wondering if you've looked into biomimicry principles in your design.
We do. I would say we probably have a lot to learn from you, but I really see as part of understanding the landscape and understanding what's out there. And not, when you're tackling a new problem, it's not just looking at the traditional solutions, but looking at how nature's addressing things, looking at how cultures are addressing things. And even with the water pump that I worked on before, if you think about landscape, people were looking at diesel engines and, wells and different types of pumps, but also, for example, part of the landscape was the local tribal kind of elder who did a rain dance. Like that was one of the ways the local people were thinking about how to get more water. So my perspective is we can definitely learn more, but everything is part of how we learn to come up with the best solution.
With so many needs out there, how do you choose which ones to focus on?
That's a great question. There are so many needs. I mentioned Dr. Kamla, who you saw the photo of earlier, who started us on the Brilliance project, but all of our projects start with a user identifying them. And this is very powerful if your goal is impact, because if you're designing for users who want the product, there's no trying to convince them to do something, which I think is something we see a lot in international development. But in terms of like the nuts and bolts of how we choose what to work on, we have this long set of criteria, and it ranges from like, are we the right people to be doing this? Can we build the partnerships and the systems to get this product to market? And it's also kind of mundane things too, like what's the timeline? Do we have enough money to get it there? But it's a set of criteria that we run things through.
Can you tell us how you manage intellectual property?
Yeah, great question. So we protect all our intellectual property. And the reason why we do this is because we have control over it and we can make decisions about what happens. And the main reason why we do that is for our partnerships. I mentioned Phoenix Medical System. They would not have done a partnership with us if we hadn't protected the intellectual property of Brilliance. And again, like if groups knock off Brilliance, as a nonprofit person trying to like save the world and get more babies treated, I'm actually okay with that. The challenge is when you have low quality knockoffs. And we've seen that time and time again, and that's something I saw when I worked on treadle pumps, is a lot of knockoffs of the pump that were very poor quality, even painted the same color blue, which is very famous in East Africa, but painted the same color blue, and it confused users. So that's the main reason why those are the main reasons why we protect our IP.
Someone would like to know, is D-Rev self-sustaining, or do you require grant funding as well?
Oh, great question too. So the way our model works is that we raise philanthropic funds for R&D. So if you remember the arrow, the identifying the design phase, we raise philanthropic funds for that. And that's one of the reasons why we're able to have a lower retail price in the end, because we don't have to recoup that R&D investment. So once the product hits the market, it needs to be totally economically self-sustaining on its own. And so to give you a sense, it cost us about $1.2 million to bring Brilliance to market. And we invest like almost nothing in it now, and it just keeps scaling. We do put a little bit more money, philanthropic money, into impact assessment. And that's because I personally don't feel that our customers should bear the cost of our measuring the impact of our devices.
On that note, do you think about how your customers can produce financing, and is that something that you guys work on?
We don't work so much on the financing end. We found that for the most part, purchasers it works itself out. One of the interesting things is we've had, I would say, almost the opposite situation, where we've had purchasers or customers come to us and say, what's wrong with this product? It's too cheap. Like there's some catch somewhere. And we've addressed that by having very well-established and good reputation. Our partners have a very good reputation. And in fact, when we did due diligence in hospitals, before we selected Phoenix as our partner, or tried to get them to partner with us, we went around to different hospitals and we said, so what products do you like? Who responds to your servicing calls? Which products don't you really like, or which companies don't you really like that much? And Phoenix actually came to the top of the list, and they had a better reputation than some of the big players like GE, even in India.
It's a great segue. So we've had some conversations about what design can teach corporations, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on design influencing CSR.
That's a big question. Okay, the one thing I will say is design to me, I mean, I mentioned this, is so powerful. And it's powerful in the sense that it, to me, it's the focus is on the problem solving and all of the things that need to happen with problem solving. And I know design thinking has gotten a bit of a, oh God, are we going to talk about it again status. But I'm really a true believer. And so I would so encourage, and I think I'm preaching to the converted here, but everyone having designers on staff and everyone within an organization having some kind of design training. I am one of those people who believes that anyone can do design. Some of my design friends are like, stop saying that. But again, if you're focused on problem solving and you have this set of tools, it can only help, right? It can only help you do better. And I also think companies do so much better if their products are better and they're solving users' problems.
What advice do you have for startups or designers who aren't in that world but are wanting to get more into social impact design?
Suggestions for the future. That's a really tough one. I think one of the things that's happened is we've seen this incredible growth of university programs around social impact and sustainable design, but there isn't necessarily places for them to go. So maybe some of these CSR programs, if any of you are connected, can be hiring some of these students. But the one thing I do recommend when folks contact me is just get experience. You don't need to go to Kenya, you don't need to go to Iraq, but just getting hands-on experience in a different context, you know, working on a different kind of problem that you may not otherwise be familiar with. And I think that's how you start to become a designer.
Are there any new projects that you're excited about but aren't out yet?
I can't talk about our new projects though, but I'm sure I'm not the first person to say that.
Okay, fair enough.
Should we do one more?
One more, okay.
Does that sound okay?
Yep.
Great.
A lot of discussions have been about how existing industries are reacting to all these new ideas. So can you talk a little bit about how the big brands have reacted to the launch of your low-cost prosthetics, and are there any tensions there?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question too. You know, in the early days of D-Rev, the big companies could just ignore us because we were just like one more like well-intentioned group trying to do design. But as we've gotten a little bit bigger, we are starting to beat out some of the bigger players. And they are noticing. And it's funny, every once in a while, a big one will loop around and say, you know, kind of float acquisition talks with us, which I think is really funny as a nonprofit. It's like, what's there to acquire? But I think, you know, this is the message I've had, which seems to be working, is we're actually not competing. The markets that we're serving, the hospitals we're serving, weren't actually being served by some of these big players. And those hospitals can't afford to pay $3,000 or $9,000 by the time it gets to Kenya. So we're actually not touching their market. We're getting into a segment that they haven't addressed. And I saw one question on here that I will close with, if that's okay, because I think it's a great question too, is why is D-Rev a nonprofit? I would say like monthly we get a call from like a social impact investors like, hey, when you decide to become a for-profit, give us a call. This is the reality though, is if you're a nonprofit, we can focus on impact. You know, the financial return does matter to us because I feel like that's an important buy-in. But my friends who have taken the for-profit or the hybrid route, they've really struggled with that trade-off. And we're able to say, no, we're really focused. We can take the best qualities of the for-profit world and but we can still focus on impact. One of the interesting things that we found because of our structure and our orientation, and I don't love talking about a nonprofit, like we're a social benefit company. It's just, you know, our focus is impact compared to the financials. But what we've seen in places like India too is we're actually a trusted group at the table because they know we're not just about our product, we're about solving the problem. So we've been able to give input into how the Indian government, for example, selects and specifies certain medical devices for their hospitals. And technically, a for-profit would never be part of that.
Great, well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.